Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, a history of insanity in the Age of Reason, in a way also a history of sanity, is one of the major works of history of the last 100 years or so. It is, in a way, a defining book of 20th century culture, but it is not an easy book to read. It's written in a grand style with extraordinarily forceful opinions and with an undercurrent of, I guess, passionate personal engagement with the history of madness that can be both engaging but somewhat at times off-putting. But nonetheless, I really encourage viewers of the Burning Archive channel to read Michel Foucault's works on madness, either Madness and Civilization or the full book, The History of Madness, Histoire de la Folie, which has been translated into English in full in the last, 10 years or so. You have probably heard of this book. It was enormously influential both in its time. It helped make Michel Foucault's career, but it also, in a way, defined a certain form of politics, a politics of, I guess, personal experience, of the personal being, political, madness, gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth. And it is also in many ways a deeply poetical work, although in a sort of grand French philosophical style that sometimes can be a little bit hard to read unless, I guess, you listen to it carefully and slowly. So I'm going to offer you a reading of preface and conclusion of Madness and Civilization, or History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, shortly. But I also just wanted to say that this book has been an incredibly important book, not just in the culture, but for me personally. I first, and you can probably see the very old, sort of almost decaying edition of Michel Foucault's book that I bought, I think, about the age of 19, about 40 odd years ago. In the International Bookshop in Melbourne, the old sort of left-wing communist bookshop, where in fact in the back shelves you could at that stage still buy the collected works of Stalin if you were of that kind of ilk. But I bought this book, and of course it spoke deeply to me because my family have had significant issues with mental illness, and it's been an issue I have long been engaged with. And something about this book, as you will find as you listen to this reading, leapt outside of the limits of just an academic study or an intellectual approach to the history of madness. It was very much a personal, passionate, poetical engagement with the meaning of madness and why and how societies, cultures, power label some people mad and others not, and what the consequences of that are. The book itself was written in the late 1950s and early 1960s. In fact, it is an edited version of Michel Foucault's PhD or doctoral thesis, a thesis he studied in Uppsala University in Sweden and finally presented to a major French intellectual, Georges Canguilhem, in Paris, in the Sorbonne, and yet his supervisor, who was a much more practical man than many French intellectuals of the 1960s, was not all that impressed with the poetical way in which Michel Foucault interpreted the documents of history, and many historians since have similarly been sceptical of some of the claims of Foucault. But even so, you can almost regard this book as a kind of something that goes beyond a mere plain academic history. It's something which engages with the experience of madness in a different way that makes pedantic criticisms of it perhaps just pedantic criticisms. Now, I reread this book recently after nearly, 30 or 40 years would have been the last time I read this book. And it was funny how when you come back to a book later in life, you often see it in a different way. And this book, I found it harder to really enjoy than perhaps I did back in my 20s. I was going to say 1920s. And I found it had lost some of its lyrical power, or perhaps some of that lyrical power had lost its power over me with my experiences over those last 40 years. Indeed, I found, as I have learnt much more about Michel Foucault's life, which I won't go into now, but I did find some of the passages of the book a little bit more off-putting, a little bit more almost too revealing of a sense of celebration of sadism and violence that is a feature of, and indeed sexual exploitation that was a feature of Michel Foucault's life. Indeed, as I was reading the conclusion, I found a certain passage on the French writer and infamous person, the Marquis de Sade, the person who sadism is named after. I found a certain passage just a little bit too much to cope with. So I've actually excised that from the reading and tried to leave you the rest. Even so, despite those misgivings, I really do think this book is one of the more important, cultural treasures of the 20th century. It is a breakthrough work in many ways, a work whose factual claims have been revised many times, but whose poetical power in engaging historically with the experience of madness has perhaps never quite been matched. So I hope you enjoy my sharing of my rereading after 40 years of Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, a history of insanity in the age of reason. And you can also, I might add, read the full translation of his History of Madness, L'Histoire de la Folie, but I've chosen to read Madness and Civilization because it's a more popular, abridged and widely available work. And I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you next time. Michel Foucault, Madness and Civilization, Preface and Conclusion. Preface. Pascal, quote, "Men are so necessarily mad that not to be mad would amount to another form of madness." And Dostoevsky in his Diary of a Writer, "It is not by confining one's neighbour that one is convinced of one's own sanity." We have yet to write that history of that other form of madness by which men, in an act of sovereign reason, can find their neighbours and communicate and recognise each other through the merciless language of non-madness. To define the moment of this conspiracy before it was permanently established in the realm of truth, before it was revived by the lyricism of protest, we must try to return in history to that 0 point in the course of madness at which madness is an undifferentiated
experience, a not yet divided experience of division itself. We must describe from the start of its trajectory that other form which relegates reason and madness to one side or the other of its action, as things henceforth external, deaf to all exchange, and as though dead to one another. This is doubtless an uncomfortable region. To explore it, we must renounce the convenience of terminal truths and never let ourselves be guided by what we may know of madness. None of the concepts of psychopathology, even and especially in the implicit process of retrospections, can play an organising role. What is constitutive is the action that divides madness, and not the science elaborated once this division is made and calm restored. What is originative is the caesura that establishes the distance between reason and non-reason, reason's subjugation of non-reason, resting from its truth as madness, crime or disease, derives explicitly from this point. Hence we must speak of that initial dispute without assuming a victory, or the right to a victory. We must speak of those actions re-examined in history, leaving in abeyance all that may figure as a conclusion, as a refuge in truth. We shall have to speak of this act of scission, of this distance set, of this void instituted between reason and what is not reason, without ever relying upon the fulfilment of what it claims to be. Then and then only can we determine the realm in which the man of madness and the man of reason, moving apart, are not yet disjunct, and in an incipient and very crude language, antedating that of science, begin the dialogue of their breach, testifying in a fugitive way that they still speak to each other. Here madness and non-madness, reason and non-reason, are inextricably involved, inseparable at the moment when they do not yet exist, and existing for each other in relation to each other in the exchange which separates them. In the serene world of mental illness, modern man no longer communicates with the madman. On one hand, the man of reason delegates the physician to madness, thereby authorizing a relation only through the abstract universality of disease. On the other, the man of madness communicates with society only by the intermediary of an equally abstract reason, which is order, physical and moral constraint, the anonymous pressure of the group, the requirements of conformity. As for a common language, there is no such thing, or rather, there is no such thing any longer. The constitution of madness as a mental illness at the end of the 18th century affords the evidence of a broken dialogue, posits the separation as already effected, and thrusts into oblivion all those stammered, imperfect words without fixed syntax in which the exchange between madness and reason was made. The language of psychiatry which is a monologue of reason about madness, has been established only on the basis of such a silence. I have not tried to write the history of that language, but rather the archaeology of that silence. The Greeks had a relation to something that they called hubris. This relation was not merely one of condemnation. The existence of Thrasymachus or of Callicles suffices to prove it, even if their language has reached us, already enveloped in the reassuring dialectic of Socrates. But the Greek logos had no contrary. European man, since the beginning of the Middle Ages, has had a relation to something he calls indiscriminately madness, dementia, insanity. Perhaps it is to this obscure presence that Western reason owes something of its depth, as the sophrosine of the Socratic reasoners owes something to the threat of hubris. In any case, the reason-madness nexus constitutes for Western culture one of the dimensions of its originality. It already accompanied that culture long before Hieronymus Bosch, and will follow it long after Nietzsche and Artaud. What then is this confrontation beneath the language of reason? Where can an interrogation lead us which does not follow reason in its horizontal course, but seeks to retrace in time that constant verticality which confronts European culture with what it is not, establishes its range by its own derangement? What realm do we enter, which is neither the history of knowledge nor history itself, which is controlled by neither the teleology of truth nor the rational sequence of causes, since causes have value and meaning only beyond the division? A realm, no doubt, where what is in question is the limits rather than the identity of a culture. The classical period from Willis to Pinel, from the frenzies of Racine's Oreste to Sard's Juliet and the Quinta del Sordo of Goya, covers precisely that epoch in which the exchange between madness and reason modifies its language, and in a radical manner. In the history of madness, two events indicate this change with a singular clarity. 1657, the creation of the Hôpital Général and the great confinement of the poor. 1794, the liberation of the chained inmates of Bicêtre. Between these two unique and symmetrical events, something happens whose ambiguity has left the historians of medicine at a loss. Blind repression in an absolutist regime, according to some, but according to others, the gradual discovery by science and philanthropy of madness in its positive truth. As a matter of fact, beneath these reversible meanings, a structure is forming which does not resolve the ambiguity, but determines it. It is this structure which accounts for the transition from the medieval and humanist experience of madness to our own experience, which confines insanity within mental illness. In the Middle Ages and until the Renaissance, man's dispute with madness was a dramatic debate in which he confronted the secret powers of the world. The experience of madness was clouded by images of the fall and the will of God, of the beast and the metamorphosis, and of all the marvellous secrets of knowledge. In our era, the experience of madness remains silent in the composure of a knowledge which, knowing too much about madness, forgets it. But from one of these experiences to the other, the shift has been made by a world without images, without positive character, in a kind of silent transparency which reveals, as mute institution, act without commentary, immediate knowledge, a great motionless structure. This structure is one of neither drama nor knowledge. It is the point where history is immobilized in the tragic category which both establishes and impugns it. Conclusion. The Goya who painted the madhouse must have experienced before that grovel of flesh in the void, that nakedness among bare walls, something related to a contemporary pathos. The symbolic tinsel that crowned the insane kings left in full view suppliant bodies, bodies vulnerable to chains and whips, which contradicted the delirium of the faces, less by the poverty of these trappings than by the human truth which radiated from all that unprofaned flesh. The man in the tricorn is not mad because he has stuck an old hat upon his nakedness, but within this madman in a hat rises by the inarticulate power of his muscular body, of his savage, marvellously unconstricted youth, a human presence already liberated and somehow free since the beginning of time by his birthright. The madhouse is less concerned with madness and those strange faces one finds elsewhere in the capriccios, moreover, than with the vast monotony of these new bodies, shown in all their vigour, and whose gestures, if they invoke their dreams, celebrate especially their dark freedom. Its language is close to the world of Pinel. The Goya of the Disparates and the Quinta del Sordo addresses himself to another madness, not that of madmen cast into prison, but that of man cast into darkness. Does Goya not link us by memory with the old world of enchantments, of fantastic rides of witches perched on the branches of dead trees? Is not the monster whispering its secrets into the ears of the monk related to the gnome who fascinated Bosch's St. Anthony? But they are different for Goya, and their prestige, which overshadows all his later work, derives from another power. For Bosch or Bruegel, these forms are generated by the world itself through the fissures of a strange poetry. They rise from stones and plants. They well out of an animal howl. The whole complicity of nature is not too much for their dance. Goya's forms are born out of nothing. They have no background, in the double sense that they are silhouetted against only the most monotonous darkness, and that nothing can assign them their origin, their limit, and their nature. The Disparates are without landscape, without walls, without setting, and this is still a further difference from the Capriccios. There is not a star in the night sky of the great human bats we see in the way of flying. The branch on which these witches jabber, out of what tree does it grow? Does it fly? Toward what Sabbath and what clearing? Nothing in all this deals with a world, neither this one nor any other. It is indeed a question of that sleep of reason which Goya in 1797 had already made the first image of the universal idiom. It is a question of a night which is doubtless that of classical unreason, that triple night in which Orestes sank. But in that night man communicates with what is deepest in himself and with what is most solitary. The desert of Bosch's St. Anthony was infinitely populous, and even if it was a product of her imagination, the landscape that Doul Gréé moved through was marked by a whole human language. Goya's monk, with that hot beast against his back, its paws on his shoulders and its mouth panting at his ear, remains alone. No secret is revealed. All that is present is the most internal and at the same time the most savagely free of forces. The power which hacks apart the bodies in the grand disparate, which breaks free and assaults our eyes in the raging madness. Beyond that point, the faces themselves decompose. This is no longer the madness of the caprichos which tied on masks truer than the truth of faces. This is a madness beneath the mask, a madness that eats away faces, corrodes features. There are no longer eyes or mouths, but glances shot from nowhere and staring at nothing, as in the witch's Sabbath, or screams from black holes, as in the pilgrimage of St. Isidore. Madness has become man's possibility of abolishing both man and the world. And even those images that challenge the world and deform man. It is far beyond dreams, beyond the nightmare of bestiality, the last recourse, the end and the beginning of everything. Not because it is a promise, as in German lyricism, but because it is the ambiguity of chaos and apocalypse. Goya's idiot, who shrieks and twists his shoulder to escape from the nothingness that imprisons him. Is this the birth of the first man and his first movement toward liberty, or the last convulsion of the last dying man? And this madness that links and divides time, that twists the world into the ring of a single night, this madness so foreign to the experience of its contemporaries, does it not transmit to those able to receive it, to Nietzsche and to Artaud, those barely audible voices of classical unreason, in which it was always a question of nothingness and night, but amplifying them now to shrieks and frenzy, but giving them for the first time an expression, a droit de cité, and a hold on Western culture, which makes possible all contestations as well as total contestation, but restoring their primitive savagery. Sartre's calm, patient language also gathers up the final words of unreason and also gives them, for the future, a remoter meaning. Between Goya's broken drawings and that uninterrupted stream of words continuing from the first volume of Justine to the 10th of Juliet, there is doubtless nothing in common except a certain movement that retraces the course of contemporary lyricism, drying up its sources, rediscovering the secret of unreason's nothingness. Within the chateau where Sartre's hero confines himself, within the convents, the forests, the dungeons where he endlessly pursues the agony of his victims, it seems at first glance that nature can act with utter freedom. There man rediscovers a truth he had forgotten, though it was manifest. What desire can be contrary to nature, since it was given to man by nature itself, and since it was taught by nature in the great lesson of life and death which never stops repeating itself in the world? The madness of desire, insane murders, the most unreasonable passions, all are wisdom and reason, since they are a part of the order of nature. Everything that morality and religion, everything that a clumsy society has stifled in man, revives in the castle of murders. There man is finally attuned to his own nature, or rather by an ethic peculiar to this strange confinement. Man must scrupulously maintain without deviation his fidelity to nature. A strict task, a total enterprise. You will know nothing unless you have known everything. If you are timid enough to stop with nature, she will escape you forever. Conversely, if man has wounded or changed nature, it is man's task to repair the damage through the mathematics of a sovereign vengeance. Nature caused us all to be born equal. If fate is pleased to disturb this plan of the general law, it is our responsibility to correct its caprice and to repair by our attention the usurpations of the stronger. The slowness of revenge, like the insolence of desire, belongs to nature. There is nothing that the madness of men invents which is not even nature made manifest or nature restored. But this is only the first phase of Sartre's thought. The ironic justification, both rational and lyrical, the gigantic pastiche of Rousseau. Beyond this demonstration by absurdity of the inanity of contemporary philosophy, beyond all its verbiage about man and nature, the real decisions are still to be made. Decisions that are also breaks in which the links between man and his natural being disappear. The famous Society of the Friends of Crime, the project of a Swedish constitution, once we remove their stinging references to the social contract and to the proposed constitutions for Poland or Corsica, established nothing but the sovereign rigour of subjectivity in the rejection of all natural liberty and all natural equality. Uncontrolled disposal of one member by the other, the unconditional exercise of violence, the limitless application of the right of death. This entire society, whose only link is the very rejection of a link, appears to be a dismissal of nature. The only cohesion asked of individuals is intended to protect not a natural existence, but the free exercise of sovereignty over and against nature. The relation established by Rousseau is precisely reversed. Sovereignty no longer transposes the natural existence. The latter is only an object for the sovereign which permits him to measure his total liberty. Followed to its logical conclusion, desire leads only in appearance to the rediscovery of nature. Actually, for Sartre, there is no return to the natal terrain. No hope that the first rejection of social order may surreptitiously become the re-established order of happiness, though through a dialectic of nature, renouncing and thus confirming itself. The solitary madness of desire that still for Hegel, as for the 18th century philosophers, plunges man into a natural world that is immediately resumed in a social world. For Sartre, as for Goya, unreason continues to watch by night. But in this vigil it joins with fresh powers. The non-being it once was now becomes the power to annihilate. Through Sartre and Goya, the Western world received the possibility of transcending its reason in violence and of recovering tragic experience beyond the promises of dialectic. After Sartre and Goya, and since them, unreason has belonged to whatever is decisive for the modern world in any work of art. That is, whatever any work of art contains that is both murderous and constraining. The madness of Tasso, the melancholia of Swift, the delirium of Rousseau belong to their works, just as these works belong to their authors. Here in the text, there in the lives of the men, the same violence spoke, or the same bitterness. Visions certainly were exchanged, language and delirium interlaced. But further, the work of art and madness in classical experience were more profoundly united at another level, paradoxically at the point where they limited one another. For there existed a region where madness challenged the work of art, reduced it ironically, made of its iconographic landscape a pathological world of hallucinations. That language which was delirium was not a work of art, and conversely delirium was robbed of its meagre truth as madness, if it was called a work of art. But by admitting this very fact, there was no reduction of one by the other, but rather, remembering Montaigne, a discovery of the central incertitude where the work of art is born, at the moment when it stops being born and is truly a work of art. In this opposition to which Tasso and Swift bore witness after Lucretius, and which it was vain to attempt to separate into lucid intervals and crises, was disclosed a distance where the very truth of a work of art raised a problem. Was it madness or a work of art? Inspiration or hallucination? A spontaneous babble of words? Or the pure origins of language? Must its truth, even before its birth, be taken from the wretched truth of men, or discovered far beyond its origin in the being that it presumes? The madness of the writer was for other men the chance to see being born over and over again, in the discouragement of repetition and disease, the truth of the work of art. The madness of Nietzsche, the madness of Van Gogh or of Artaud belongs to their work perhaps neither more nor less profoundly, but in quite another way. The frequency in the modern world of works of art that explode out of madness no doubt proves nothing about the reason of that world, about the meaning of such works, or even about the relations formed and broken between the real world and the artists who produced such works. And yet this frequency must be taken seriously, as if it were the insistence of a question. From the time of Hölderlin and Nabal, the number of writers, painters and musicians who have succumbed to madness has increased. But let us make no mistake here, between madness and the work of art there has been no accommodation, no more constant exchange, no communication of languages. Their opposition is much more dangerous than formerly, and their competition now allows no quarter. Theirs is a game of life and death. Artaud's madness does not slip through the fissures of the work of art. His madness is precisely the absence of the work of art, the reiterated presence of that absence, its central void experienced and measured in all its endless dimensions. Nietzsche's last cry, proclaiming himself both Christ and Dionysos, is not on the border of reason and unreason in the perspective of the work of art, their common dream, finally realised and immediately vanishing, of a reconciliation of the shepherds of Arcady and the fishermen of Tiberias. It is the very annihilation of the work of art, the point where it becomes impossible and where it must fall silent. The hammer has just fallen from the philosopher's hands, and Van Gogh, who did not want to ask permission from doctors to paint pictures, knew quite well that his work and his madness were incompatible. Madness is the absolute break with the work of art. It forms the constitutive moment of abolition which dissolves in time the truth of the work of art. It draws the exterior edge, the line of dissolution, the contour against the void. Artaud's oeuvre experiences its own absence in madness, but that experience, the fresh courage of that ordeal, all those words hurled against a fundamental absence of language, all that space of physical suffering and terror which surrounds or rather coincides with the void, that is the work of art itself, the sheer cliff over the abyss of the work's absence. Madness is no longer the space of indecision through which it was possible to glimpse the original truth of the work of art, but the decision beyond which this truth ceases irrevocably and hangs forever over history. It is of little importance on exactly which day in the autumn of 1888 Nietzsche went mad for good, and after which his texts no longer afford philosophy but psychiatry. All of them, including the postcard to Strindberg, belong to Nietzsche, and all are related to the birth of tragedy. But we must not think of this continuity in terms of a system, of a thematics, or even of an existence. Nietzsche's madness, that is, the dissolution of his thought, is that by which his thought opens out onto the modern world. What made it impossible makes it immediate for us. What took it from Nietzsche offers it to us. This does not mean that madness is the only language common to the work of art in the modern world. Dangers of the pathos of malediction, inverse and symmetrical danger of psychoanalyses, but it means that through madness, a work that seems to drown in the world, to reveal there in its nonsense, and to transfigure itself with the features of pathology alone, actually engages within itself the world's time, masters it and leads it. But a madness which interrupts it, a work of art, opens a void, a moment of silence, a question without answer, provokes a breach without reconciliation, where the world is forced to question itself. What is necessarily a profanation in the work of art returns to that point, and in the time of that work, swamped in madness, the world is made aware of its guilt. Henceforth, and through the mediation of madness, it is the world that becomes culpable for the first time in the Western world in relation to the work of art. It is now arraigned by the work of art, obliged to order itself by its language, compelled by it to a task of recognition, of reparation, to the task of restoring reason from that unreason and to that unreason. The madness in which the work of art is engulfed is the space of our enterprise. It is the endless path to fulfillment. It is our mixed vocation of apostle and exegete. This is why it makes little difference when the first voice of madness insinuated itself into Nietzsche's pride, into Van Gogh's humility. There is no madness except as the final instant of the work of art. The work endlessly drives madness to its limit. Where there is a work of art, there is no madness. And yet madness is contemporary with the work of art, since it inaugurates the time of its truth. The moment when together the work of art and madness are born and fulfilled is the beginning of the time when the world finds itself arraigned by that work of art and responsible before it for what it is. Ruse and new triumph of madness. The world that thought to measure and justify madness through psychology must justify itself before madness, since in its struggles and agonies it measures itself by the excess of works like those of Nietzsche, of Van Gogh, of Artaud, and nothing in itself, especially not what it can know of madness, assures the world that it is justified by such works of madness.